So today we're going to be compression testing. Now this is more of a diagnostic video, but it'll teach you the principles on why we should compression test and how to conduct it pretty much on any engine. So a good reason for doing this test is if your engine's running rough, where fuel is okay and ignition is okay, so the spark plugs are working, your coils are good and your fuel delivery is good, it might be time to do a compression test. The engine's misfiring, where fuel and spark are okay, and your engine could be knocking or pinging, indicating high compression. So some of the reasons why you might want to try this test and get a diagnostic on this issue. So let's talk about what this test does. Now, this is a diagnostic video. So the compression test tests for how well the cylinders are compressing. If there's poor compression, this test will indicate this on our compression gauge. This engine here, the Honda engine, has 6 cylinders. These are sealed chambers known as combustion chambers, so it's where the combustion takes place. So here we're testing the seals within the combustion chamber for this test. Now, to have good compression, you don't want any leaks of any sort. It needs to be able to compress effectively with no leak out or leak down. Now, the compression test will tell you how well a cylinder is performing, how good the compression is. If you do have a leak, then you can do what's called a leak down test, and the leak down test will tell you where the leak is. So that's the difference. So the leak down is more where, and the compression is do I have one. So that's the difference between those two tests, and in this video we're going to be doing the compression test. So this is a Honda V6 engine, so 6 cylinders, 6 spark plugs, 6 coils. We're going to be testing all 6 on here. This is a Mustang. It's a 4.6 litre engine. It's a V8. So on here we have 8 cylinders. We're going to be testing all 8 cylinders. And again, 8 plugs, 8 coils. So again, it doesn't really matter what engine you have. The principle is going to be the same. So if you have poor compression, so let's say low compression, it will cause an incomplete burn of the air to fuel mixture that your car requires to run, resulting in a misfire. It could be many things. It could be the valves, so the intake or exhaust valves at the top of the chamber. It could be the piston rings at the bottom of the chamber. It could be just carbon buildup forming a bad seal. It could be a head gasket, many different things. On the other hand, it could be high cylinder compression, where the compression's too high. You'll get like a knocking or a pinging sound. So one such example, this could happen where there is liquid oil or high carbon deposits in the combustion chamber. In this case, there isn't much room for air and fuel to mix, therefore the pressure can read high. So high and low are bad. We want to find out what the spec is and make sure we're compressing to the spec. So some of those things that cause poor compression, the piston rings, the valve seals at the top, again the head gasket, it could be a warped cylinder head or engine block. So other than those, it could be a loose spark plug which could cause poor compression, something as simple as that, or it could be something more complicated like a warped head, or at least more expensive to fix. So here are the few basic tools you'll need to do the compression test. Most importantly, you will need a compression gauge, and this will actually tell us how well the cylinder is compressing. I'll link all the parts in the description below so you can check those out. When you buy the compression gauge, it will come with various adapters, so it's just a case of matching up the adapter width with the width of your spark plug threads. You will need a small chart for recording the pressure readings of your various cylinders. So on a V6 engine, 6 cylinders, so we need results for 6 slots here. If it's a V8, then you'll need 8 slots. If you only have 4 cylinders, then you only need 4. So really that's for your vehicle there. Something to take the coils out, so the coils sit on the plugs. Various extensions, some plugs might be hard to get to, the body of the car might be in the way, so we'll be feeding down small extensions to get to those hard to reach ones. A standard wrench here just to get the plugs out. One socket with rubber in the end, and that helps pull the plugs out, and one without the rubber that helps us put them back again so it doesn't stick to the plugs, and a little bit of oil for an optional wet test, and I'll talk about the wet test very soon. Now, compression test can be done on a hot or cold engine. It really depends what the service manual states for the engine type. This Honda engine, it's recommended that it's done cold. Actually, it specifically says it has to be done on a cold engine, because removing spark plugs on a hot engine with an aluminium head such as this one may cause spark plug thread damage or cylinder head damage. So we're doing the compression test cold on this engine. If you highly suspect damage to the cylinders in any way, then perform a cold compression test. Okay, during this test we'll be cranking the engine and using a lot of battery juice, so it's good to make sure the battery is fully charged. Now, a well charged battery will read about 12.6 DC volts on the multimeter. This one's 12.8, so we're good to go. So when we do this compression test, we're going to be removing the spark plugs. So we don't want fuel squirting into the combustion chamber from the injectors, and also we don't want voltage supplied to the coils, which has nowhere to go because the spark plugs will be removed. So it's just a case of finding the fuses for those two things and removing them. So in this vehicle, it's just a case of looking in the fuse box and identifying which fuses belong to the fuel injectors and which ones belong to the ignition. So you can see here, this is the V6 engine. There's the ignition fuse, it's a 15 amp. And the fuel injectors there, the V6, that's a 10 amp. So there's the diagram. And those two are the fuses. I've put marker pen on the top so you can see those. So we're going to be pulling the blue fuse here and the 10 amp red fuse there, and that will disable the ignition, so we're not getting a spark into these coils and causing any damage to ourselves or anything else. And also the fuel flow, so we're not squirting fuel into the chamber from the injectors. So the fuse is removed. We'll set this aside. Next, we're going to remove all the coils that sit on top of the spark plugs and all the spark plugs themselves. So the V6 engine, we're going to be removing all these coils here. So here's one. It's just the case of pushing on this tab, pulling off the connection there, and then using a number 6 Allen wrench here to remove this out and pulling the coil out. And we're going to repeat this 6 times. For the ones at the back, you will need to remove the air duct assembly. So on this one, it's a flat head and another flat head here. Pull the ductwork out of the way. Once this 10 millimeters out, then we can access the rear one. So remove all 6 coils and all 6 plugs. On the Mustang engine, very similar process. Remove the ductwork here, so flat head, remove this out the way, then we can access the coils here, these yellow things here, and they're bolted down with a small 8mm socket. So very similar process depending on what engine and what coil configuration you have. So taking the plugs out of an engine in this configuration where you have the sort of banks on each side is relatively easy. Maybe the back ones might be a little awkward. But on engines where you have the banks sort of front to back, you might find the rear ones are quite hard to get to, so you have to get a little creative. What I generally do is put down the spark plug socket with the rubber grommet inside, put that down the well, so I'll just do that now. So in it goes, and then I start inserting small extensions one after the other to go into there. And then finally, once I've inserted 2 or 3 of these extensions, I can put the wrench on the end of it and sort of pull it out that way. That's just because you can't fit this extension, this long one here, in this short amount of space. So that's a little trick on getting the awkward ones out of the back or an awkward part of the engine. So here we have all our coils removed. You can inspect them, while you're in here, check there's no oil or any signs of arcing or anything like that. These generally look okay, so now I'm going to take the spark plugs out. So all the spark plugs have been removed, the coils are here. What I've done, I've put them in the layout that they are on the engine. That way, if I have a misfire code for cylinder number 2, well, looking at a cylinder diagram on this specific engine, it goes cylinder 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I know that something with this cylinder here, cylinder number 2, if it's P0302, is something wrong. It could be the spark plug, it could be the coil. Now what you could do in that instance is when you reassemble it, you could put number 2 plug and coil in, say, position number 5, and if the code jumps here, so instead of 302 it's 305, and you've moved the plug and coil here, then you know it's either the plug or the coil that's the problem. So that's why I put them in order, so when I put them back, if I do have a code, I can switch them and sort of work it out that way. So just a little tip there. So looking at the plugs gives you a good window into the combustion chamber. Do they have oil on them? Do they have a worn electrode? Do they have deposits on there? Various things can tell you a lot about what's going on just by looking at the plugs. Here's a chart here, so you can see here. Let's look at this plug because this is the worst one I pulled out. The others look okay. Let's see if we can get this on video. So looking at this plug here, you can see the ground electrode there. That's the strap that comes over. And it's pretty worn and there's a little bit of oil on the end. So using a chart like this, you can sort of determine what your plug looks like and determine the reasons for this. So this is a really good diagram for things like this. So you can see on this vehicle we do have a slightly rough idle. We do have misfire codes, and the electrode is worn, so it's indicating we need new plugs, but this is sort of like the reason. If you don't have a code or anything like that, they can sort of indicate, what the problem is, depending what the plugs look like. So a diagram like this is very useful, and again you can sort of see it now in the video, so you can compare your plugs against it. So a little tip there while these are all out. One other thing while the plugs are out is to check the gap here between the center electrode, which is this little spiky bit there, and the ground electrode, that's the strap coming over. The coil supplies voltage, quite high voltage to the top here. This is a porcelain insulator, so it insulates everything here, so this part doesn't touch the ground, which is the outside, and it eventually produces a spark when it jumps from the center electrode to the ground strap. In a very simplistic way, that's how they work. So having a proper gap here is actually critical to the functioning of the engine. If the spark plug gap is not correctly set, it can cause lots of issues such as loss of power, misfires, spark plug fouling, increased plug wear, and poor gas mileage. If the gap's too small, it'll give too weak of a spark. It can even make the car run rich as there's an incomplete burn of fuel. If it's too wide, then it, again, not firing correctly, and it can cause misfires. I have a video on setting up the spark plug gap and how that works, and a bit more information about it and how you do it. I'll link that in the description below. But while they're out, it's definitely good to check that and adjust them as necessary. So we're going to start measuring some pressure in these cylinders now. What we're going to do is check that we have the correct adapter for the spark plug. So it's just a case of checking the width of those and making sure we have the right one on there. If you need an adapter, you can attach that now, at least you know which one it is. When using an adapter, say the default sort of socket doesn't fit and you need an adapter, so you screw that on, make sure these two connections are quite tight, because the last thing you want to do is get this adapter stuck in the spark plug well, and you're threading it out, this part comes out, this part's stuck in, so you're in a bit of a pickle. So let's begin testing. What we're going to do, we're going to take our compression gauge with the right end on, we're going to slide it down the spark plug well and just hand thread it into the spark plug socket. Not very tight at all, but make sure it's in there. Only hand tight. So it doesn't matter which order you start in, the point is just to make sure you don't get lost. So I've laid out my diagram in order the cylinders appear on the engine, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm starting with number 6 just because it's easy to access. No real reason, it doesn't matter. Make sure the gauge is threaded in hand tight, don't go crazy, just so it's nice and snug. Give it a tug just to make sure it's solid, and make sure your gauge reads absolute 0 on here. So we're all reset, we're all good to go. So we're inside the car now. When we crank the engine, we want to make sure the gas pedal is on the floor, so full throttle right there. So hold that down while we actually turn the key. For those of you that are interested on why we're actually opening the throttle plate by holding down the accelerator while cranking the vehicle, I'll just say really quickly, closing the throttle, so not holding the accelerator, reduces the amount of air sucked into the cylinder during the intake stroke. Having less air in the cylinder means there is a lower pressure at bottom dead center, so that when the piston now moves up and compresses the air, the maximum or peak pressure is lower than it could have been. The lower pressure means that the readings will be misleading. So if you encounter an engine with low compression readings on all the cylinders, you should consider there's something maybe obstructing the airflow to all cylinders as well. So we need to open the throttle plate basically while we crank the engine. So accelerate it down, turn the key. So we're going to crank the engine, accelerate it down for 5 compression strokes or 5 puffs. So that is plenty. So looking at the gauge, the PSI is the orange scale. You pick the scale you want. So that's 220 PSI on cylinder number 6. So now we have the PSI recorded for cylinder 6. We're going to release the pressure by pressing this button. All the pressure's out there, so we can now unscrew it out of the cylinder. And we're going to repeat the exact same process for cylinders 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. So let's get cracking on with that now. So here's a little emergency tip. If you were using an adapter such as this and you attached it to the end and this part got stuck in the spark plug well and it's just down there, you can't get it out, then insert this back into the adapter in the well, crank the engine 5 times, get it under pressure, and then rather than releasing the pressure here, just unscrew the whole thing together, and that should just force this with this out. So little tip there. So here are the results here, all the pressures for each cylinder there. From the manual, this is what the manual states: the maximum compression variation is 28 psi. So that's the difference between the minimum one and the maximum one, so the variation. So there's our maximum, 220, here's our minimum. The difference is actually 28, so we're sitting on the borderline. Now this is an engine that's almost got 250,000 miles on it, so this is pretty good compression for something of that age. But this is sort of how we interpret the results. If you don't have the spec available, the maximum compression variation, you just cannot find it. A rule I like to go with is 80%, something like that. So 80% of 220 is 176. So your minimum shouldn't be less than 176, so that's 80%. Some people say 70, I like to go with 80, but the manual here says 28 psi difference, so we're acceptable. Now say for example, if you have a cylinder which is fallen way below tolerance, say this figure was 140 and you knew something was wrong. Now we can't really work out if it's the head gasket or the valves or anything like that, but one thing we can test is the piston rings, the seal of the bottom of the combustion chamber, as it comes up and provides us with our compression. That's something we can do, and this is what's called a wet test. Now the wet test revolves around putting 1 teaspoon of oil, just a teaspoon, down the spark plug well, and when we put the oil down the well, it will seal all the inconsistencies around the piston. So the piston ring here, say if we have a carbon buildup or something like that and it's preventing a good seal as we compress, the oil will just fill all those inconsistencies, all the gaps there, and when it comes up for the compression stroke, we're going to get better compression. Well, hopefully, if that's the problem. If it's a head gasket, again, this won't really work with that, but it will tell you, it'll give you a good indication whether it's the piston rings here. So this is what a wet test is, and we can use a turkey baster to avoid mess. So we're just going to drop a teaspoon of oil into cylinder number 2. So just like the dry test, we're going to crank it 5 times again. And we're going to check the results to see if our reading has improved. So if we look at the reading now, we've gone up a little bit. It was almost at 200. And when that happens, it might just be something as simple as a carbon buildup or something like that. But again, for an engine this old, we're not doing too bad really. If it was a brand new engine, I'd probably start to worry. So the wet test, you don't have to do it for all cylinders. I mean, if you have a cylinder giving you 220 psi, there's not really much point doing a wet test on that. It's almost perfect compression for this year, make and model of vehicle. So as the service manual also says, only do the wet test on the ones that seem underperforming or ones of serious concern. That is the point of a wet test, just to confirm if it's the piston rings. So let's just talk about interpreting the results a little more. You know, not everyone's going to have great compression. Some of your figures might be off, especially if you're running this test because you feel something is wrong. So in a normal world, compression builds up quickly and evenly to the specified compression for each cylinder. Now, if you don't have that, you have an abnormal result, so let's talk about those. Now, if your piston rings are leaking, maybe it's carbon deposits or something like that, then compression is low on the first stroke. Then compression builds up with the following strokes, but doesn't really reach normal or spec. Compression improves with a wet test when you add oil. So it could be the carbon buildup around the rings. You may notice oil on the spark plug threads, just a little, maybe bluish smoke out of the exhaust pipe, or foul-smelling exhaust smoke, which is just a sign your car's burning a little oil. Carbon buildup symptoms. So you could have carbon buildup on the piston rings or ring grooves. It can prevent the rings from sealing properly, and that's why it creates the low compression, as we saw there. Valves leaking, so they're at the top of the combustion chamber, so the intake and the exhaust valves. So compression is low on the first stroke, but compression usually does not build up on the following strokes. Compression does not improve much when you add oil. That's because the oil can't seal the valves because they're in the air. Gravity doesn't allow that, unfortunately. You may notice a little oil on the spark plug threads or bluish smoke out the exhaust. If the valve guides are leaking, then oil can enter the spark plug wells. If two adjacent cylinders have low compression, so say cylinder 6 and cylinder 5, then we could suspect a head gasket leak between those two cylinders. It's hard to check whether we have a head gasket leak, say on the outside, so between 6 and just the sort of outside void, but we can check based on compression of these two adjacent ones, we could have a failing head gasket between there. You can confirm your diagnosis with other tools. So one way of doing it is just to take the coolant overflow off here, start the engine so it's running, and with the cap off you can check the presence for bubbles. So you'll see the coolant bubbling there. That's a good indication you have quite a bad head gasket failure. Another one is to take the oil cap off and check for residue underneath. It will be milky underneath here. It will be milky because coolant is mixing with oil, and that's why we get milky residue. You can also look in here to see if you have milky residue. And the last one, a block tester. So again, you pull this off. It's a special chemical that checks for exhaust gases in your coolant. So you just put it in here. It's like a cork, and it's like yellow liquid, and it turns a different color if it detects exhaust emissions in the coolant. And a block test is useful for a very minor failure. If it's a major failure, you will see bubbles and milky goo, but a more minor one, a block tester, will sort of give you that diagnosis. And the last one, again, not a sort of definite large list, but another one is if all cylinders are low, so low compression on all of them, then you can suspect valve timing. So the camshaft timing is lightly off due to maybe a slip timing belt or something like that. So they're the popular ones. It's not a full list, but some of the sort of common ones. So if you suspect, say, carbon buildup, it could be something as simple as that. Carbon buildup is indicative of doing lots of short trips. So say you work 5 miles away, your car can't heat up, you're not doing any freeway driving, you can't blow that carbon out, it's just getting stuck and building up in there. So you could use something like seafoam or something like that, but if you want to confirm your diagnosis, you can get a borescope or an endoscope and just slide it down the spark plug well. So it's a little camera on a stick, and you can have a look around to see if there's any carbon buildup. I have a video on that. I'll link it in the description below so you can check that out. So say you know now you have a compression problem from this compression test, because you will always do a compression test first in this instance. Then you can perform what's called a leak down test. And what a leak down test does is measures the amount of compression which is lost within a cylinder. So it helps us find where the leak is for the poor compression, and also an indication of how big the leak is. So again, we would run the compression test first, so we know there's a problem, we know which cylinder it is, and then the leak down gives us the sort of where and how big. So that's the difference between compression and leak down. Leak down, you need more specialist equipment. If you don't fancy purchasing that, renting it, or whatever else, then you have this information. So you could go to a mechanic and say, hey, I've done a compression test, because the mechanic might do that first and then do a leak down. You can knock some money off your bill, so at least it's not all for nothing, and at least you've learned something, or maybe the compression test actually helped you fix your problem. So yeah, it's good, really. So I hope you learned something from watching this on how to do a compression test and get an actual diagnosis on your car before throwing parts at it and things aren't working. The worst thing is if you have a head gasket leak, for example, and you have poor compression. Most people just buy plugs, they buy coils, they're just throwing all this money at it and it's not fixing it. Later they find out it's a head gasket leak. They get quoted $3,000 or pounds or whatever to fix it. They don't want to fix it, so they're scrapping a car with new plugs and coils on. I see it all the time. So compression test, you get a thorough diagnosis and you've done it yourself and you've saved a lot of money. So I hope this video helped you, and thank you for watching.